This video will showcase how volume splines can be used to create your own custom volumes to fit your requirements. In this example, I'd like to produce a tool to distribute resources across an environment. We'll make the implementation nice and simple for brevity. First, let's establish how we'd like it to work. Take this example of an orange biome in a grey surroundings with a river running through. We want to distribute pink fish in the river, green plants in the orange biome, and black rocks in the grey surroundings. This means that we'll need to define a region for the orange biome, a region for the river, and a region for the grey surroundings. The river crosses through the orange biome, so we're going to have to stop plants being placed in the river. This means that our tool needs to support exclusion zones, where resources are not placed despite being within the zone. The plan for this program is to pick a random spot, check if it's inside the volume spline, and check whether it's a valid position. Then, repeat this until we've reached the necessary count for each resource, or until it's no longer possible to place any more. Volume splines have a built-in function which will provide the smallest x and y coordinate of any points, not necessarily the same points, and largest x and y coordinates. This essentially allows you to create the smallest possible square aligned to the x and z axes, which contains the entire volume spline, which I'll call the volume spline's bounding box. This is the area in which we will pick random positions and check if they're valid. Once we've got a position in the XZ plane, we'll raycast down to find the terrain height at that point, and then check to make sure there are no other resources with an exclusion radius using a sphere overlap. Then, we just need to check whether it's contained by any exclusion zones, and if not, we can place the resource and move on to the next one. Inside your Unity project, make a new script called Volume Spline Distribution Zone and open it up. First things first, we need to change the class from which it inherits. Instead of mono behavior, it should be volume spline. This will require us to add the EA Bewley Publishing.volume splines namespace. Also, let's remove the starting stuff. We don't need it. We're going to need to know some information which is unique to each resource we want to distribute. So let's make a struct called resource, which contains the game object, how many times we want it to appear, the exclusion radius, and the disallowed layers. The exclusion radius is a minimum distance between one resource and another, which is necessary to ensure they don't overlap when placed. The disallowed layers are the layers that we don't want our resource to overlap with. It's alright if it's touching the terrain, but it cannot be touching other resources, so we can filter this with layers. The struct is also going to need to be marked as serializable for it to show up in the inspector. Now, let's add an array of these as a public variable. We also need exclusion zones, for when another zone we don't want to place resources in overlaps the current zone. We can just make that an array of volume splines. You could make it an array of volume spline distribution zones, but an array of volume splines will allow you to use any variation of volume spline as an exclusion zone. Let's also add a helper function, clear, which will remove all the resources currently placed by this zone. I want to be able to run this without entering play mode, so we have to use destroy immediate instead of destroy. Let's move on to the main function, which I'm going to call initialize. Let's start by getting the minimum and maximum positions. These are returned as vector2s with the x and z coordinates in the x and y positions of the vector2 respectively. Now, let's add a for each loop to go through each resource. Each resource has a number of times it wants to be placed, so let's add a for loop to go through each of these. Then, because it's very possible the random position isn't valid, let's add a while loop to repeat the placement code up to 10 times per resource placement. Now for the placement. This code produces a random position within the volume spline's bounding box at the very top of it. Height refers to the difference in height between the top and bottom of the volume spline itself. Then we can set up a raycast going vertically down with the correct range to end at the bottom of the volume and not go beyond it. It's important to make sure your terrain is contained within the volume and not beneath it. This will cause the raycast to not intersect the terrain and as such not place any resources. If that raycast is successful, we can check whether the point is within the volume spline with the inherited isPointInside function. If so, we can use physics.overlapSphere to ensure it's not intersecting any other resources. This is where the layers and exclusion radius are coming into use. If that's successful, we can go through each of the exclusion zones and check whether they contain the point as well. If they don't, we can instantiate our resource and break out of the attempts loop, moving on to the next item of that resource. If we fail any of these previous checks, the program will go back through the attempts loop up to 10 times until it is successful. That's all the primary functionality set up, but if we're going to run it outside of play mode, then we're going to need to set up a custom editor. When setting up custom editors with Volume Splines, it's important to inherit from Volume Spline Editor to make sure you still get all of the existing editor elements essential for modifying Volume Splines. This is a very simple custom editor, as all we really need to do is add 2 buttons. For formatting, let's add a space and then a bold title for Distributor Parameters. Then, let's add a button for Distribute Props and one for clearing them. The Distribute Props button will first run the clear function and then the initialize function to ensure there aren't too many resources being placed, while the clear button will just clear the resources. Now we can go and test this code.